It is 1 a.m. in Washington, 1 p.m. in Kuala Lumpur, and 2 on a Wednesday afternoon here in Seoul. I'm Moon Conn-young. Here are the top stories making headlines at this hour. South Korea is pushing to purchase roughly 10 low-altitude radars from Israel to better detect small unmanned aerial vehicles and thereby counter threats posed by North Korean drones. North Korea's rubber-stamped Supreme People's Council kicks off in Pyongyang, the first of its kind under the Kim Jong-un leadership. Now, it will provide a glimpse into any changes in the reclusive state's leadership. And crisis in Ukraine, the U.S. issues a stark warning that Moscow could be orchestrating another Crimea-style intervention in eastern Ukraine. Washington's top diplomat has suggested holding a four-way talks with the EU, Russia, and Ukraine. We'll have those stories and more, but first, let us begin this Wednesday afternoon with North Korea holding its first session of the 13th Supreme People's Assembly this Wednesday. The meeting, which is equivalent to a parliamentary session, will give the world a better idea about the changes in the regime's policies and power structure. Arirang News Foreign Affairs correspondent Hwang Seong-hee starts us off.
North Korea's 13th Supreme People's Assembly session got underway in Pyongyang on Wednesday. It marks the first session of the rubber-stamp parliament elected under Kim Jong-un's leadership. As widely expected, the young Kim was represented as the chairman of the powerful National Defense Commission, according to the state-run Korean Central News Agency. Other agenda items at the meeting include appointing officials for government posts and deliberating on this year's budget plan. The first session of the country's highest legislative body is an occasion to find out who's in and who's out of North Korea's ruling circle, and speculation is that a major reshuffle could be in the works. Sources say Prime Minister Park Bong-ju, the country's economic policymaker, could be sacked to take responsibility for failed economic reform plans. 86-year-old figurehead President Kim Jong-un may step down after 15 years in office. Possible successors to the positions include Kim Jong-un, top policymaker in charge of inter-Korean matters, and Vice Premier Kang Seok-ju. The meeting comes as North Korea has been raising tensions on the Korean peninsula with a series of missile launches, artillery shellings, and threats to conduct another nuclear test. All eyes are on what kind of a message the regime will send to South Korea and the United States. Hwang Seong-hee, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, down here in the south, the South Korean government is wasting little time bolstering its air surveillance system after discovering 3 probable North Korean drones on its territory in recent weeks. Seoul wants to buy some seriously advanced radar systems from Israel that should help the South Korean military detect any unwanted visitors in the sky. Our Connie Kim reports.
The discoveries of 3 suspected North Korean drones in less than a month on South Korean soil has prompted Seoul to take action. The government said Wednesday that it would be adopting Israel's tactical air surveillance radar system. A government source said an emergency budget of around $19 million will be drawn up to purchase 10 low-altitude radars this year. The RPS-42 radars will be deployed at key government facilities, including the presidential office and on the West Coast next year. The South's current radars aren't capable of detecting the North's small-sized drones, but the newly adopted Israeli system is. It can detect all types of aerial objects as small as half a meter in size within a 30-kilometer radius and has an altitude range of 10 kilometers. The Korean military has been under fire for allowing the unmanned aerial vehicles infiltrate its airspace, which represents a national security threat. In another effort to boost the nation's military readiness, Korea has asked the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency to purchase more than 100 advanced missiles. The agency said Tuesday that it had notified Congress of a possible sale of missiles, equipment, and parts to Seoul. Korea plans to buy 76 Sidewinder Block II all-up-round missiles and 32 captive air training missiles at a cost of nearly $100 million to help counter threats from North Korea. Connie Kim, Arirang News.
And South Korea's plans to beef up its surveillance capabilities in the skies don't end there with the purchase of the Israeli radars. South Korean Defense Minister Kim Jong-un is briefing the Parliamentary Defense Committee on this Wednesday over the government's plans to counter suspected North Korean drones. Now, in addition to buying advanced low-altitude surveillance radars and anti-aircraft guns, the military is also considering providing financial rewards to anyone who reports spotting a drone. The defense chief also said the military will deploy 4 unmanned aerial aircraft for reconnaissance purposes in western seaborder areas. Meanwhile, South Korea, the U.S. and Japan, who have taken a tough stance against North Korea's provocations, upped the pressure on Pyongyang this week. However, the different political agendas of the so-called 6 parties involved in talks to denuclearize the North seem to have become a stumbling block to progress. Choi Yu-sun has more.
Earlier this week, the chief nuclear negotiators of South Korea, the U.S. and Japan were united in pressuring North Korea not to carry out a 4th nuclear test.
It would be a direct provocation to the international community and a grave threat to global peace and stability. We, along with the international community, will make sure North Korea pays for it.
There has been an over-decade-long push by the so-called 6 parties to denuclearize the North, but efforts seem to have become entangled in each participating country's political interests. Behind the 3 parties' unified voice, Seoul and Washington reportedly demanded Tokyo's transparency in its recently revived 2-way dialogue with Pyongyang. The Abe administration is determined to get answers from the North about its abductions of Japanese nationals during the 1970s and 80s. North Korea's traditional ally, China, which wants unconditional dialogue resumption with Pyongyang, is urging the other 3 parties to be more prudent in their choice of words or actions. In keeping check of each other's military dominance in the Asia-Pacific this week, the U.S. and China, both key members in resolving the nuclear issue, were engaged in a war of words over China's territorial claims in the region. With cracks appearing in relations among the 6-party members, analysts say the 6 parties' handling of North Korea will likely depend on Washington and Beijing's level of cooperation. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
Now, over in Ukraine, the U.S. issued a stark warning on Tuesday that Moscow could be orchestrating another Crimea-style intervention in eastern Ukraine. Now, this after pro-Russian forces cemented their control of a government building in the city of Donetsk, and there were claims that in Lugansk, protesters had taken up to 60 people hostage. Now, against this backdrop, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry has suggested holding a 4-way talks with the EU, Russia, and Ukraine. Here's our Kwon So-ah with the latest on the worsening crisis.
With no immediate end to the Ukraine crisis in sight, senior officials from the EU, the US, Russia and Ukraine will try to find common ground in 4-way talks next week, likely in Europe. It will represent the first such meeting since the crisis began. The talks were suggested by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as he accused Russian forces of stirring up separatist turmoil in the eastern part of Ukraine. He told Moscow to back down or face tougher new sanctions that would target Russia's banking, energy, mining and arms sectors. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen warned Russia too, saying a further intervention in Ukraine would be a, quote, historic mistake and that it would lead to a further international isolation for Russia. The crisis worsened over the weekend when pro-Russian activists seized regional government buildings in 3 eastern Ukrainian cities. On Tuesday, Ukraine's Interior Ministry said it had detained some 70 people during an anti-terrorist operation in Kharkiv, but that protesters are still in control of a state security building in Luhansk. He says they are armed and holding around 60 people hostage. Protesters occupying a government building in Donetsk have declared a People's Republic of Donetsk and are planning a referendum to join the Russian Republic by May 11th. It's a potential powder keg as the polarization of pro-Russians and pro-Ukrainians in the 3 cities is greater than it was in Crimea, which Russia annexed a month ago. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
And latest developments in the search for the missing Malaysian Airlines Flight 370. there are hints of hope again as search teams have picked up new signals that may be consistent with the black box flight data recorder. Australian authorities heard two separate signals on two separate occasions on Tuesday. The vessel had first detected pings on Saturday in the southern Indian Ocean. Officials are growing more confident that they are now looking in the right area. Search teams are in a race against time, of course, as the batteries of the flight recorder could run out any day or any minute now. The Boeing 777 disappeared on March 8th, carrying 239 people on board. The search on Wednesday includes 11 military planes, 4 civilian aircraft, and 14 ships.
All of the day's important events close to home and around the world. Join Moon Conn-young live from Seoul.
Mobile shopping market for the dual use of the Korean name East Sea and Japanese name Sea of Japan in school textbooks in the state of Virginia. Well, with the widespread of the internet now, Korean consumers are turning more and more to the net to purchase products from abroad, and understandably so that as they can get much better deals there. Well, to reverse the trend and level the playing field for consumers, the Korean government is stepping in. Our Song Ji-sun explains.
Import prices of these products are around $10. But the very same product on the shelf of a department store carries a price tag 4 times higher. That's the case with many imported products, after distribution margins and marketing prices are taken into account. To provide consumers with sufficient information and to stabilize prices, the government has added the import prices of 10 industrial products, like wine, strollers, and lipstick, to its publicly available list. The import price list previously included 60 food products. The Customs Office said the cheaper the import price of an item, the more expensive its retail price became, as a monopoly among domestic distributors meant no price competitiveness. This gap between the import and retail prices has led more and more Korean consumers to directly purchase products from overseas over the years, mostly online. Direct overseas shopping tripled from 2010 to $1 billion last year. The beefed-up import price list is only one change the government is making to support consumers. At an economic ministerial meeting on Wednesday, Finance Minister Hyun Ho-seok announced that the customs clearance process would be sped up to allow consumers to claim their purchased items more quickly. They will also be able to return their products purchased overseas with less fuss and get tax refunds more easily thanks to simplified procedures. The government will also encourage free market competition among importers by facilitating parallel imports, all part of its goal to lower the retail prices of imported consumer goods by up to 20% over the next 3 years. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Well, the financial health of Korea's major conglomerates has improved drastically over the past 10 years. Local market researcher CEO Score said Wednesday that the debt ratio of Korea's top 30 large enterprises dropped to around 83% last year, nearly 20 percentage points lower than in 2004, when the figure stood at over 100%. The improved financial health of the bottom 20 large companies of these 30 was especially pronounced. They saw their debt ratio drop by around 25 percentage points. Microsoft Korea says it will extend a line of credit to governmental and public institutions so they can upgrade their computer systems to the latest version of Windows. Now this after the US-based software giant pulled the plug on free support and updates for Windows XP. The move comes as some of Korea's public organizations, which have a track record of being hacked, continue to use the 13-year-old operating system due to their limited budgets. The grace period will allow the institutions to upgrade their OS now and pay for it next year. Meanwhile, the government says it's closely monitoring the situation and will offer free software vaccines to keep XP users secure. Now, Now, in recent weeks, the world has been hit with a number of sizable earthquakes, and Korea was one of them. Just yesterday, measuring equipment in Korea recorded a magnitude 2.6 aftershock, following a 5.1 magnitude earthquake that occurred last week off the western part of the peninsula. That was quite a rare incident here in Korea. Well, could the quakes detected in Korea possibly mean that tied to the others throughout the world? Well, our Shin Se-min might have some answers.
A powerful magnitude 8.2 earthquake struck off the northern coast of Chile's Pacific coast on April 2nd, killing at least 6 people. In late March, also on the Pacific coast, Los Angeles was hit by a magnitude 5.1 earthquake, followed by more than 100 aftershocks. A total of 31 earthquakes with a magnitude of 6 or higher have occurred worldwide this year, and 70% of them have taken place in Pacific coastal areas on the Ring of Fire, a horseshoe-shaped line that stretches around the Pacific coast. Experts say the recent quakes all share a common factor.
Most earthquakes are due to forces that build up from past-time quakes. So we can say that almost all earthquakes are interconnected in some way. For instance, the Chilean earthquake this month might have been influenced by powerful quakes in 1960.
This same rule applies all the way across the Pacific to the Asian Pacific region. Japan is still in the stages of recovery from its 2011 Tohoku 9.0 earthquake, and Korea is not immune. The fourth strongest quake ever to hit the peninsula, a magnitude 5.1, struck on April 1st. Most people in Korea believe that the country is relatively safe from earthquake since it sits on the Eurasian plate away from borders with a lot of movement. However, experts say that people should take a closer look at Korea's history. Documents from the Joseon Dynasty of Korea, or the Annals of the Joseon Dynasty, note that from 1413 to 1865, more than 2,000 earthquakes, some in the magnitude 7 range, hit the Korean peninsula. Those historical records and the recent events clearly prove that although Korea sits on a comparably safe tectonic plate, no place on Earth is completely safe. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
And now it's time for our daily arts and culture segment with our Im Yoon-hee. Now today she has an item for those that lived through the 90s will appreciate. Good afternoon to you, Yoon-hee.
Good afternoon. So I think it's safe to say that those who remember the 90s think very fondly of that decade, and it was a really big turning point in the music industry here in Korea.
Right, and that's when K-pop really emerged. Many artists blew in like a storm, and just as quickly they faded.
Exactly, but some of these artists actually stayed on the scene, and they're still making a presence. So let's take a look.
Last year, the hit drama Reply 1994 showed just how fondly Korea remembers the 90s. The coming-of-age drama, set in the mid-1990s, captured the nostalgic essence of the era. The final episode brought in an 11.9% ranking, the highest ever for a Korean cable channel episode. The 90s was a memorable decade for many and is known as the golden age of K-pop. Some of Korea's most iconic singers emerged at that time, and almost 20 years later, the legends are still going strong. Singer Lee Sun-hee swept the charts with her single Dear Jay years ago and became known as a tiny giant because of her petite frame but explosive voice. Still ever present in the music industry, she recently released an album to commemorate the last 30 years of her career. The album contains 11 songs, 9 of which she personally composed, and 7 of which she wrote the lyrics to.
Truthfully, I remember when I had a lot of fans and all of the popularity I had turned into this strength. Now I can keep going and put everything into this album.
Another 90s star who still hasn't put down the mic is Lee Eun-mi. Nicknamed the Barefoot Diva, she recently released a new album. Titled Spiro Spere, the album has a touch of Latin influence and is about finding hope where there is life.
For 10 years, I've loved to sing, and now how do I grow my passion even more? I'm not sure. I just do whatever comes to me.
Next month, Lee Sora, another 90s wonder, has plans to take the stage. Ahead of the release of her album, she's also released a single called I'm a Star. These 90s divas made quite the impression back then, and it looks like they're not done yet.
You know, Yoonhee, if I'm not mistaken, there was another TV show that really hit big about 2 years ago that was released called Reply 1994 that also 1997, excuse me, that really tapped into the nostalgia of the 90s, but the 1997 was a precedent to the 1994, am I correct?
Exactly, so very confusing. These two dramas are made by the same network, the same team actually, but the storylines are completely different. However, the soundtrack from the 1997, the most recent one, which was released last year, became a huge success, and part of that was because the soundtrack contained popular mixes from songs from the 90s, and so people, as you can imagine, were very excited about these remakes.
Right, and you know, these women are also very iconic figures, some, you know, from the 90s, but we can't forget how popular the male artists were back then as well.
Right, so there were some heartthrobs during that time, and they really swept the scene, and they are still present in the music industry as well. Let's take a look at some of them.
When he first debuted in 1998, his hit ballad changed the Korean music scene. To Heaven became popular for its plot within the video and catapulted Cho Sung-mo into the spotlight. He continued his success, becoming the king of ballads and selling over 1 million copies of 5 different albums. But that was 10 years ago, and now he's taking the stage as a part of his Memory 1998 tour to promote the release of his newest album, Wind of Change.
Once in a while, you hear the voice of a veteran singer. Nowadays, I'm very comfortable and I've been able to rise above the chaos while recording this album. This album is about my life and my destiny.
There were many other overnight hits during the 90s, songs that were a fun mix of pop and rock. But nobody produced as many as the man known as the hitmaker. Ju Young-hoon is one of the most famous composers in the industry, and his list of works is one to be reckoned with. Who better to create a collaboration of 90s hits than someone who's composed over 300 songs, many of which went on to dominate the charts.
People are surprised when I tell them I composed the Seongjin-woo's song Don't Give Up. So I want the general audience to rediscover me through the many songs I've composed. I'm very happy to be able to do that.
The 90s hit Twist King, originally performed by Turbo, has been remade and released by Ju in collaboration with Rose Motel. It's a retro and vintage take on the song that once swept the nation and the charts.
You know, I think I remember when that song came out, everywhere we went, it was playing. You know, wherever we were, that song was playing.
So it was a huge success, not only in Korea, but throughout Asia. This Twist King song was widely popular everywhere.
What about this new version of that song?
Right, so people's sentiment is generally kind of on the fence about this. So this new song by Rose Motel, they're saying, is not quite the same as the original by Turbo, and I think that's mainly due to the fact that people just really want this Turbo group, this duo, to come back together because they kind of fell apart abruptly, leaving a lot of their fans hanging.
Right, so and that was about a decade ago. So hopefully we will see them come back and other singers from the 90s as well.
Exactly.
All right, thank you, Yoonhee, for that, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.
See you then.
Good afternoon. It's going to be warmer here in the nation today compared to yesterday, and things might feel more like early summer than spring, with highs in some regions reaching up to the mid-20s. But while the weather is gorgeous, we also have this dry weather advisory throughout the nation, which will stay with us until the weekend with the arrival of the rain. Now, for more details, let's shift over to our satellite map. We have another day of clear skies nationwide, but there is light layer of fog at the moment, which will slowly clear up as we progress into the day. Now, moving over to our temperature readings. Seoul tops out at 19 degrees this afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Gwangju and Busan will peak up to 24 and 21 degrees. Now, moving over to other regions, Jeju Island and Dokdo both peaks at 17, while Mankumgang tops out at 16. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you, Conn-young.
All right, thanks, Michelle, for that. And that's all for me at this hour. I'm Moon Conn-young in Seoul. Chip back with Arirang at 4 p.m. Korea time for Business Today.